10,000 Americans are turning 65 every day, with substantial consequences for how our society thinks about life, living, and community. It also means that more people, whether they're 65 or 45, are thinking about their second half of life and where and how to live to make the most of those years. The question of places is a significant one because we now have more choices and decisions than ever before. Should I move to a different part of the country? Is it the city or the suburbs or a rural area right for me? Should I move closer to family? Should I stay in my own house or look to a different solution ranging from senior living to building a granny flat? And what can technology do for me in making the second half of life as good or better than the first? These are critical questions to make, and hard ones too, because they often require examination of personal values, issues of family compromise, and the ability to project forward to what you would want your life to be like 10, 20, 30 years down the road. So we're very fortunate today to have with us Ryan Frederick to talk through some of those choices with us. I don't think anyone in this country has done more and better thinking on these issues than Ryan. Even before he graduated from the Graduate School of Business at Stanford, he was already focused on the importance of place in an aging society. He's now the founder and CEO of Here, a national consulting firm and content platform on the topic of place and healthy longevity. And he's also the author of Right Place, Right Time, the ultimate guide to choosing a home for the second half of life. Thank you, Ryan, for being with us today.
My pleasure, Ken.
All right. So I always say, as those of you who attend these events from time to time know, this is the point in the talk track where I say, we want your questions, and we always do, but we especially want them today because we know how important and personal this topic is to so many of you. Please put your questions in the Q&A, and producer Kate will be helping us get to as many of your questions as we can. She's also going to be entering resources in the chat where you can find the book and how you can find out more about Ryan and his work. But now I'm going to turn to Martha, my partner in crime.
So Ryan, first of all, I have to tell you how much I appreciated this book. I sort of am in that window where I need to be thinking about what's next. And I thought you did a terrific job in sort of presenting lots of options and not stating there is one right option. And I also appreciate how practical the steps were that you suggested. So thank you for that. I was telling Ken and Kate before we got started that I've already sent it to a number of friends of mine who are battling as couples with what they're going to do in their next chapter. But what I am really super curious about is you talk about in the book about how when you were your internship when you were at the GSB, the Graduate School of Business, you were working for interning for a senior living facility, and you made it part of your internship to live in the facility. What graduate student would want to do that?
Well, I would say my mom was concerned what career path I was following. So around the time I was at GSB, I graduated in 2005. Around that time, the D School was coming to be. And this idea of design thinking by observing and watching was, I'm not sure if it was quite in vogue yet, but it was gaining steam. And I felt, for a variety of reasons, that I wanted to really see the environment of place lived out through the eyes of people that are living, in this case, in a retirement community. And fortunately, part of the story was I had no experience in this before. I studied engineering in college. I'd worked in Silicon Valley. I really came out from an entirely different place. And I wrote a letter to these senior housing executives, about a dozen. I didn't know anyone. Only one person responded, and that was the CEO of Sunrise Senior Living at the time. And so when I met with him, I shared this idea that I wanted to live in a community, and he was surprised by it and said something to the effect, "I'm not sure how we can pay you for this, but we worked it out." Mm-hmm. What did happen is I couldn't talk my wife into joining me, so I was left unsupervised in a independent living community for about a month outside Atlanta. And it was fantastic, Martha. They opened my eyes to the ways in which place impacts us. In this case, in the senior living context, And I got a lot of unsolicited cookies, brunch invitations. I was the only male or person under 75 and on my wings. I got a lot of attention, but it really, I'm so glad I did it. In fact, really not a week goes by where I don't think about some of the stories and some lessons I learned in that experience. And it ultimately inspired me writing this book. One of the pieces too I want to mention is that while I saw the impact of place in the senior living context for older adults, it also helped me understand how we're shaped by place no matter what age and stage. And in a much more profound way than I previously had thought.
So Ryan, we actually have our first question. Actually, we have more than one question. One's about home share, and I want to get to that. But before we do, I want to know a little bit more for the audience about the Ryan and Frederick story. So you told us sort of the creation story of how you started, but you've been involved in the development of senior housing. You've been involved in place. Tell us a little bit about sort of how you got from that place in Atlanta to where you are today.
Yeah. So it's been close to 20 years now, Ken, going back to that summer internship. And I've had, to me, my fascination is on the intersection of healthy longevity, clearly at the core of a lot of your work at Stanford, but then place. Where do those intersect? And for a good chunk of that 20 years, I had spent on the senior housing side, but as a real estate investor, private equity investor, as a executive at one of the largest senior housing companies in the country, and also a developer, developing kind of new models, in particular on the intergenerational side of things. Like, what if we push back on some of the traditional senior housing models, or at least offer a wider breadth of options? And so what's happened is, along that journey, I've been able to see, I would say, from the inside of how, in this case, the industry is formed, but yet also be able to innovate. And then more recently, do a lot of strategy consulting with multifamily developers, normal housing developers, some on the senior housing side as well. And in that journey, it really did germinate the idea of this book, because I felt that there was a lot of information and knowledge that I had learned on the specifically on the supply side, the industry side, that I thought would be really helpful for people on the consumer side. Like how should you really be thinking about it? And so on that path, Ken, have really gained much more of an appreciation of not just how do we create better places, I'll describe that as the supply side, but how can we better inform, better educate, better tools for people on the demand side. So it's been, and at this point, I think there's ample opportunity for improvement on both sides, to choose better places and also create better places for people to thrive.
So an interesting question came up that I'm also very interested in. You, in the book, you sort of reject the notion, you rephrase aging in place and to something called living in community, which I think is a shift that's quite interesting. Can you say more about that? Why do you think living in community sort of better reflects our objective?
Yeah, so aging in place, I have a chapter on this. I critique specifically the element of the term aging in place, and I also am critical of it as a strategy. And let's focus on the term first. So it's this idea of, when you say aging, it's as though something is happening to you. You don't have agency in it. And in place suggests that you're like a statue, you're like frozen. And when you look at the research, including Laura Carsonson's book about what are the keys to successful aging or longevity, it's about being in motion, being engaged. There's a dynamic element to it. So I think just the term is not attractive, nor is it consistent with with what the research is around how to live a long, successful life. On the strategy side, it's more problematic. And it's more problematic because there's a sense that you are, that your place, and typically when we say place, at least how people tend to use it, they think of it as their four walls, your specific home of today, that home is going to be the best place for you to thrive at every stage in life. And that I have found that is also often naive about the ways in which you are likely to thrive may involve things that your current place doesn't offer. For example, I know in some instances, people that wish to age in place and they've been there for decades, they find that they may be in a position where they once knew their neighbors, they don't know their neighbors anymore. That social connection that is so significant in thriving over a longer life, you've lost that in your own immediate community.
Mhm.
There's another very practical piece, which is a small minority, really less than 5% of the housing stock in the US has been designed with a certain modicum of universal design features to allow you to safely age in place. So I think this book and a lot of the thinking that drives the work at here is suggesting that as a society, we are better off creating more options for people to thrive. And at the same time, we're better off as individuals and families to at least consider options that exist beyond where we are today.
Mhm.
To your point earlier, Martha, I'm very appreciative for what you said about the book. In particular, I was very careful to write it in a way that didn't say, you must move here, you must do this. I try to be very intentional about laying out the framework for why this decision matters so much. And then for you to choose the right thing for your chapter in life, based on what makes most sense to you. One very last thing, I then presented living in community as an alternative term, not to necessarily say that it would overnight be as widely understood or adopted as aging in place, but at least to push back on the narrative. What about living versus aging? What about not just in place, but thinking more broadly? It's not just your four walls, but it's the broader community you're part of.
I applaud the change in phrase. We have always struggled with aging in place because we don't think that is the ultimate answer for everybody.
Yeah.
So
lots of questions. I'm actually struggling to keep up with the read of the chat. There are a couple questions about home sharing and whether that's a viable growth area. And I assume, tell me if I'm wrong on this, Ryan, home sharing means renting out a room for perhaps someone younger. Why don't you actually, is that what home sharing refers to? And is that a growth area? What are the pros and cons of it?
I think it's a great idea. And going back to Martha's point, part of this is just creating more options for people for them to then choose what the right thing is for them at a given chapter in life. And so I see it, Ken, as just another option available out there. We're in an interesting time right now because we've got housing costs that have been rising in some locales at exceedingly high rates.
Yep.
Because of the inflationary conditions of today, it's expensive to buy land, to build on it. I think there's a concern about what is the supply of housing coming our way. Will it be able to match the ongoing demand? And therefore, I think it forces us to think creatively about ways of creating additional supply. It's part of the reason why I think, and I talk about this in the book, why the zoning policies allowing for more middle housing, this idea of having duplexes, triplexes, or ADUs is so significant. I'm here in Austin, Texas. That's something right now that Austin is working through, finding ways to create some of that called middle housing density. In a way, home sharing is an example of creating extra supply, because we have, particularly in suburban environments, there are quite a number of situations where people have extra rooms. that are available, being unused, underutilized. May not work well in an Airbnb context to have somewhat random people coming in from time to time. But if instead you think of it as an opportunity to enhance, if you own a home, to think about it as a way to enhance your financial well-being by renting out that room, and then having a bit of at least some level of a rigorous underwriting or diligence process to make sure you're vetting to get the right roommate, you get the benefit of some incremental revenue while also having someone else kind of, in your life that could become a close friend, could be some sort of, friendship of a different dimension, but incrementally valuable to you, particularly if you live alone. And on the other side, if you're someone looking for housing, this can be, again, a great opportunity to think about relative to other options you have. In effect, this is, one might argue, this is a version of Golden Girls-ish, circa 2023. So I think it's an interesting idea. I think it's one I am particularly concerned about, the loneliness and lack of social connection that our society, that we're struggling with. I fear that the headwinds related to it, some of which were articulated by the U.S. Surgeon General in his recent advisory in May, I think it's going to get harder over time. So the more that we can put ourselves in places where we're kind of bump into people on a regular basis rather than live alone has benefits. And by the way, if it turns out it doesn't work, you can move somewhere else. You don't have to rent the room again. So I think going back to the design thinking, this is one that I think has a fairly limited downside risk for both the person renting the room and then someone coming in.
I have to say, I just want to jump in here. Just this morning, I was listening to something and they were talking about the growing trend in mom munes, which are co-housing scenarios where single women, single mothers are increasingly choosing to share a common home.
Really?
So I think it's a trend that is beginning to become appealing across a number of demographic segments. So
there was a follow-up question to this that I want to put to Ryan. So sorry for breaking back in, but someone asked about global trends in co-housing. Came from Europe. According to this question, is Europe or any other municipality or that are doing interesting things? Are there tax incentives to encourage this? Are there regulatory schemes that are useful? What should communities be doing to make this a successful thing, because deal with what is a fairly painful housing shortage across the country?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I was able to sneak away for a European vacation last month. And so I got to see a bit of, or be reminded, I should say, of the urban density that's common in Europe, that's less common, here in the US. And one of the things that I think the Stanford Center on Longevity has done such a good job of is, and really the initial casting of the vision of the center has been this longer life, this 100-year life, it impacts everything. So it's not just something that happens at the individual level, it also happens at the institutional level. Mm-hmm. So this question gets a bit to leaders of municipalities, cities, regional leaders. What is your strategy for attracting and retaining people of all ages? And we have the World Health Organization, I write about this in the book a bit, they've launched this effort, it's probably a decade old now, it's been going for a while, around age-friendly cities. Mm-hmm. And now there's age-friendly counties, age-friendly states, and ARP has been leading the effort here in the US. So I would think about it as the people that have the biggest impact on the ways to promote co-housing are some of those regulatory leaders and business leaders at those locales. I am not, this may be true, but I'm not aware of places that are aggressively creating meaningful incentives for co-housing. One thing that got lost in the WeWork debacle is that there also was We Live. And you are seeing several other startups, and I can't remember if I conclude them in the book, but there are some others that are leaning into co-housing They tend to be doing it a bit more targeting younger people, but there's no reason why it couldn't also work for people of all ages. And I can, if there's a way I can follow up, but there are some resources I could provide after this of other companies to look at. I think it'll continue to grow, but so far that growth has been based purely on market economics.
Mhm.
It's been people seeing the benefit of shared spaces, rent per square foot being attractive. To my knowledge, there haven't been meaningful incentives where municipalities that we really want to promote co-housing in our area.
So there was a question, interesting question earlier that would be interesting to get your perspective on. Do you know of anybody, any city, any community thinking outside of the box about opportunities to repurpose deserted downtowns? You know, I live outside of San Francisco, and of course the headlines are all about, you know, dying city. So any thoughts? And know
Yeah.
anybody?
So it's a great question. I write a blog every other week on this same theme, this intersection of healthy longevity and place both literally and figuratively. I find that's a pretty big umbrella. But recently I did write, one of the blogs was on avoiding the doom loop. And so I'm going to tackle that question in two ways. I'm going to tackle it first by saying this exercise of making sure, doing your best to be in the right place at the right time, not only physically being there, but truly being present. So it's not just choosing the place, but it's engaging in the place. That exercise, it's complicated. I don't mean to daunt people, but it's complicated, but it's worth it because it matters so much. One of the elements of that is you have to play a little bit macro economist, because you have to look and understand where you are is your place, not just your four walls, your block, but generally your metropolitan area, maybe your neighborhood. Is it on an upward slope or a downward slope? And the reason I just want to share that with you is because if you own your home, for example, and you're in a downward slope situation, and you know, some of the work that the Stanford Center on Longevity has done a great job of is there's a good chance people are going to live longer than they think they are, particularly if you're educated. And so if you're in a spot that's going through a harder time and may not recover, selling your home may not be a given at an attractive price and at and quickly. And so you just need to get some sense of, you almost have to be an expert on where your place is headed. Now, let's, for a moment, back to the question, let's suppose you are living downtown in San Francisco or otherwise, you know, what is happening? Well, some places truly are in a doom loop where the tax base is being eroded because of vacancies in office, and therefore that impacting the attractiveness of retail and other uses. And there is a concern in certain places, not just San Francisco, it's actually quite a number of places throughout the country, particularly in some of the Rust Belt cities, where they were trying to recover. The Great Recession stepped it back. And where really is the future of some of those cities? What I have seen happen is, particularly in the case of shopping malls, sometimes you'll get urban shopping malls or shopping malls just on the outskirts, where those are being actively redeveloped today. They're being actively redeveloped to include more, I'll call it medical office, some healthcare. You're also seeing it being used for some housing, and some of that housing can be used, even if it's not explicitly senior living, can be an option for older adults. One of the concerns about urban areas, it is just so expensive to build in urban areas. And as some of you may have seen, the conversion from, in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, otherwise, the conversion from office to residential can be very complicated and very expensive. In some cases, it's actually the best path is to tear the building down and rebuild as purpose built for apartments. So it's a case by case situation, but I'm not seeing today like a replicable playbook that has wind behind its back.
Are you familiar with the health districts in Singapore?
I have not seen them, but I've read some about them.
Yeah, they'll be interesting to watch. Of course, Singapore has the ability to kind of say, this is how we're going to do it. But we're involved with them and looking at what they're doing and how to measure its effectiveness. But it's an interesting model, and to do exactly what you're doing, mixed use, multi-generations.
And this is why, just to go off for a moment here, this is why like the work with Jane Jacobs is still so relevant with the life and death of great American cities. This idea of keeping things at a certain level of density. It allows people to get to know their neighbors. It allows them to have agency in their neighborhoods, which where walkability is viable, where I would say increasingly bikeability is important. It's just what's happening to Paris recently. We've been hearing about the riots, either because they want to raise the pensions or what happened, unfortunately, with the encounter with police recently. But if what they're doing is they are on a pretty aggressive path of making it much more bikeable, and they're making it much more green. In fact, I understand the Champs-Elysees, for example, the expectation is they're gonna eliminate the street and make it all green and walkable. Barcelona is doing some interesting thing about creating public spaces. So this is what it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Singapore is an unusual situation because of its ability to drive change from the top down, but quite a number of cities with progressive mayors, that may lead to some substantive changes that make cities far more attractive for people to age in than remote exurbs or suburbs.
So let me,
someone just asked, what is the Singapore model? Very simply, they are building very intentional communities that are multi-use and housing facilities that are intended to attract families as well as older people in a very contained space.
Just to say one other thing on that, because we haven't talked about this quite enough, and that is, a shared friend of ours, Mark Friedman, and his work at CoGenerate, so significant because, like I said in the book, I don't prescribe you must do this, but I do believe there's an opportunity for us to create more truly intergenerational environments where it allows people to live the life that they're looking for seamlessly, naturally, and it doesn't require people to move to age segregated environments unless that really is their desire. And so I'm hopeful that we'll be seeing more of that work happen on a regional and state and local level.
So let me bring a question is from someone who sort of describes themselves as stuck in making a plan. And since you've worked with a lot of people over a lot of years, maybe you have some advice for them or for people who don't know how to really begin making a plan for the next place. So here's the fact pattern: 65 and biracial couple, present living in own home in Hawaii.
Good place to start.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, we can end it there. No, but apparently not. No children or close family here nor on mainland. Here, Hawaii is very undercapitalized in CCRCs. We are not income limited, but like our year-round outdoor lifestyle and community. Limiting most locations on mainland due to weather or politics. Any advice on how to make a plan? We feel stuck in making a decision to stay or go. So I assume that's fairly common. People feel stuck. That may lead them to maintain the status quo. How do you help people get unstuck?
Well, Ken, these are some great questions. I mean, I wrote the book to share what I've learned from the industry and other articles and talking to people. And perhaps those here on our webinar that have also written books, I found that I learned way more writing this than I'm sure anyone has reading it, because it forces you to think in a much level of granularity than I was expecting. In fact, I mentioned to Ken the other day, I hired my daughter, who's now a graduate senior in high school, but when she was a sophomore, I hired her as my editor. And before I gave it to Hopkins as the publisher, and she was so funny. She said, "Dad, I know way more about healthy aging than any normal sophomore high school girl." So, and one of these themes, though, is being stuck. It is so easy to get stuck. And it's so easy because there are so many different elements to consider. And the challenge with getting stuck is that it going back to our discussion earlier, it puts a lot of pressure on your aging in place strategy, even if that's not what your strategy, but that's what it is, because when you're stuck, you're not changing, you're not acting on it. So what I would say is this, and I was hopeful with the book, and I have reason to believe it's been helpful for quite a number of people, but in many respects, the book doesn't go far enough, because there is iterations of thinking, there's iterations of dialogue that are difficult to do when just reading a book. So what's come out of it is earlier this year, based on some nudging and pushing by some friends of mine, I did a beta test of a workshop, a 2-hour workshop, where we're actually able to go into some of the details to then apply the principles to your life, to then say, well, how can we do some things that make us unstuck? And did several of those in person, one of those online. And then some of the feedback from that was helpful, but in some cases not enough. So then did a beta test of a course, a 4-session course. And in that effort, people went through it and then had a plan on the other side. And I would say the short answer to the question is, I think you really need a process that you go through, ideally not alone, where you can get deeper into these situations. Going back to our thing about design thinking, where some of the hypotheses you might have in this particular situation about the ability to perhaps move to a CCRC in the mainland, there might be more options than you think, but there's work to go sort that out, for example. So coming next month, or soon anyway, I'll be announcing an option for more people to then sign up for a virtual version of that workshop or course. If you find yourself in a position where you're stuck and you really don't want to get stuck, because it takes some effort looking at things in different ways, dialogue with different people, and really having a process that you go through to get to the other side.
So a couple of people have brought up in the chat that CCRCs seem to be getting more and more expensive. And one attendant says, especially in the Bay Area, that only a small percentage of people can afford them. So what then?
So it's a huge issue. In fact, a woman that was part of the beta course, this is exactly her story, the solo ager in the Bay Area. And she feels priced out of CCRCs, and that's where she'd like to be. Background on that, a couple things that are happening. At one level, you have a supply and demand issue where it's difficult to build CCRCs. In fact, very few CCRCs have really been built in the last 10 to 20 years. The growth of people 75 plus is much greater than the inventory of CCRCs, particularly new ones. And just for those that aren't familiar, it's called continuing care retirement communities. In some circles now, it's more commonly called life plan communities. It's the idea that you move into independent living where you have meals, opportunities for socialization, but on that same campus, there are also access to health services, in some cases, other housing that can accommodate you. So the idea is once you move into a CCRC or life plan community, you really wouldn't have a need to move out unless you felt strongly. So you got a dynamic where the demand is greater than the supply. That's one reason that's driving up costs. Another piece, though, is the inflation that is impacting everywhere in the country, but especially in coastal areas. It's hitting there hardest, and especially on the labor market. And a CCRC, a life plan community, they have dining venues, they have healthcare, they have hospitality. There's a lot of people involved in it. And because of that, I would be surprised if the price structure doesn't continue to outpace inflation more broadly. And so the market for people that can afford that, I anticipate to get smaller. It also means that as people are living longer, if you move into a CCRC say you're 80, say you're 75, and then you live to 100, which is, again, not becoming that unusual these days, working closely with your financial advisor, you have to really be careful. Can I afford 25 years of what the cost is of a life plan or CCRC community, even if they think they can underwrite me? So one of the things that I'm finding is that more people now are looking for another chapter of housing in between maybe their single family home before they consider senior housing. Could be a townhome, could be a condo, apartment. What are some other options that allow me to be in a place that's better perhaps for my place in life, but still is before when I might need a life plan community, if that's the path you want to go down. And then for those that can't make the math work for California, this is going to sound scandalous, but it turns out there are happy people who live outside of California. And I was one of those people for, I've lived different chapters of my life in California, the Bay Area. I didn't think it was possible. And for the last 15 years, I've lived, from what I can tell, happily outside California. So one of the things about it is you may want to just think about what are other places you could move to that you might surprise yourself around the ways in which you could be fulfilled. And if you own your home, you have a currency that is that may be more valuable to trade to, another location. So I wouldn't expect that value equation to start to loop back in a more favorable way. I would consider that a reality that might even get worse over time.
In the book, I started this by saying what I appreciated is you presented lots of options. You didn't say this is what everybody should do. You talk about the pros and cons of a lot of these different options, but is there one option that everyone should at least consider?
Okay, that's good. I have, I've done a number of these interviews. This one, I haven't gotten that question before. Here's the one I would say. We have in our society, to a fault, we've created there's a brand. There is a social status that tends to be coupled with being a buyer or a renter. I was like, oh no, I own my home. Oh, I'm a renter. Like, and historically, there used to be a difference in quality around what you could rent versus what you could buy. There's still a gap today. Mm-hmm. But that gap is narrowing, particularly around some innovative product types. And one of the mistakes I found, or at least people don't consider enough, is what if I were to not actually own my residence? And one of the benefits of that thinking is that if you own your residence and it represents a high percentage of your net worth, a couple of things tend to happen. One, you are more exposed to risk based on that your housing market. You may need to move or want to move at a certain point and not be able to sell your house or sell it at a price you're looking for. So you got liquidity and valuation risk. But the other thing too that happens over time is that for a number of people, particularly people that own their house outright, that capital can get a higher return in other places, typically in the markets at large, especially over time. So I would encourage more people to, and I do this through the book, I decouple the housing product versus the ownership or rent. But I would encourage more people to take a serious look. Do I really need to own at this stage, in life versus rent? One other thing I would say that has come up a lot, which I would encourage people to think about, which goes back to how we started some of the conversation, is around design thinking. Where can I learn by doing rather than taking a big leap and then finding out I may be wrong? There's a story I think I included in the book, but an acquaintance here. I live in Austin, Texas, in our greater neighborhood. He and his wife are in their 60s. He's a lawyer. It wasn't a long commute downtown, but he wanted, this is pre-pandemic, wanted to be downtown, like cool restaurants, the closer to the Gen Zs, millennials. And his wife was up for that too. And they're like, let's go do this. So they sold their single family home, found a condo, outfitted it. He was able to walk to work. They went to all the cool restaurants and bars. They were kind of the cool kids among their friends. And for a bit of time, their friends from the suburbs would come over and see them. But after a few months, that didn't happen as much. the restaurants weren't quite as cool as they thought. In some cases, they actually had a hard time even getting into the restaurants. His wife was more of a green thumb than she realized, and she didn't have any garden to tend to. They had this thinking independently for a while before they shared it. But after about a year, they realized they made a mistake. And then they keep in mind, they sold a lot of their furniture when they sold their house. They bought new furniture. So then they had to sell their furniture, sell their condo, find a house back in the neighborhood they'd like to be in. Of course, their old house has been sold, re-outfit it. They were fortunate they were able to afford it, but it was a very expensive mistake. And so I would broadly say, really think about ways, if you're going to make a move or a significant change, how can you test it before jumping in all the way? And that you can test it by Airbnbs, you can test it by, a normal renting situation, you can test it by talking to more people. That's something I think is really important for everyone to do.
So let me first do a public service announcement. There was a lot of interest in the course that you described in the chat. Let everyone know that Kate, if you can find it, has put up a link to where you can find out more about the course. And Kate, at the end of this, because I think it's now 30 messages ago, we can put it up again at the end so people can find it if they're interested. So there was also a lot of questions about universal design. Some of them are sort of foundational. What you mentioned, universal design. Can you sort of tell us what universal design is and the challenges of making that more readily available to more people?
Yeah, and I could go on a rant about this. It's unfortunate.
Feel free.
Yeah, okay, got the green light. So I co-developed a intergenerational apartment community outside the Washington, D.C. area called The Stories. And I mentioned a bit in the book. Yeah. And it was not a big idea. The idea was many apartments that are being built today have been focused on, particularly ones in urban or suburban, where there's some level of density, focusing on millennials. And they're building generally smaller units, but they're all following a very similar playbook, where the bathrooms typically have bathtubs, and they're putting in normal tiling, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what happens is, particularly as we get older, one of our biggest risks is related to falling. And most people, when they do fall, one of the areas of greatest risk is in the bathroom, because, well, we tend to frequent it, and it may be slick, and it's also a very unforgiving surface, typically in a bathroom. And so when you fall in a bathroom, that can expedite you down a path for surgery and so on and so forth. So one of the simple things we could do is to make it easier, and this is where different government agencies can be helpful. Let's include elements of universal design in just apartments in general. If we believe that truly that people are going to be living longer, this is not something that just someone in their 70s should care about. This is someone in their 30s should care about, because they're going to live older, to be older, and they're going to want more housing that's viable for them. So there are some universal design purists that, when you look at the scope, even they want to have every box checked. I'm not a purist. I'm a bit of an 80-20 person. So when we look at bathrooms, for example, can we use slip resistant tiles? Can we find ways where we have more showers than bathtubs, with, if it's not no slip, a lip, just at least a minor lip to get in and out? Where can we put blocking behind the walls for grab bars? So if you want to have a grab bar down the road, you can do it easily. Elevating toilets a little bit, having levers, easy levers, whether it's opening a door or a faucet, having pull-out shelving where possible, raising where there's where the outlets are. I'm in my late 40s, and geez, sometimes I kneel down to put something in. It's not as easy as it once was to pop back up. So just finding there's a bunch of small things that in aggregate actually matter a lot. And so I'm an advocate of universal design. Again, I don't think you have to do every bell and whistle, because it can add up, the expenses over time, but particularly if you are redeveloping your house. and I've seen this a number of times, people sometimes struggle with not thinking about their future self enough and saying, well, what if maybe I'd want to have my master bedroom on the first floor? What if I'd want to have a master bath there? There's things, particularly in remodels, that can be easy to incorporate that don't really, doesn't cost that much money. One quick aside, we live here in Austin, as I mentioned, we relocated from the East Coast. We remodeled part of our house, and even our landscape architect, I had to like sit him down and say, we have steps into our front, but you know, we can make a very attractive path that comes in as well. Let's go figure that out. He'd never gotten that question for someone before. So there's ways we don't have to trade off attractiveness for utility. And I think that really is an opportunity for the whole ecosystem.
I think we at the Center on Longevity, we've run across a couple of developers, construction people who actually sort of their work was in universal design and mostly targeting either people with disabilities or, you know, physical impairments or older adults. What they have found is that the work they do is often as attractive to young families.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Totally.
Yeah. Again,
Can I ask you, Martha, do you want to go?
no, I think I interrupted you, so I was handing it back to you.
All right, thanks. So it's actually sort of a good thing that sort of people talking over itself, because I want to ask you about married or not married couples, yes, and the challenge of making decisions, of big decisions, long-term decisions about place. And I also really enjoyed the book. I'll say that as well. My only criticism is that all the couples got along, which is not my experience in real life. So what do you see, and how do you counsel people to work through?
And is your wife watching this?
My wife, not to my knowledge, but I did eat my own dog food. I mean, we had a substantial family cross-country move from the East Coast to Austin, and we really did follow a lot of what I advocate in terms of thinking about it. And we filled out we did some of the stuff, mapping it out. I'm not saying that there wasn't controversy at times, but actually, I think I feel grateful in the ways that we did work well together to come up with, which turned out to be a really good change for us. So yes, books can be naive, Ken, to your point. I don't think I say this explicitly in my book, but I did write this in part for my parents because they don't have a plan. And my hope was at least they would read this and make some headway. And I'm disappointed to report they haven't made as much headway as I'd like them to make. And part of that's because they don't agree on every topic in this area. I, as I mentioned, did this beta course recently, and a number of the people are coupled. Now, we didn't have couples in it. We had one person of a couple. And part of that was for freedom to share the story and not feel like there would be tension there if there might be. And it's a real issue. And I think that what's part of it, Ken, is that it makes it all the more important to just kind of get the facts out. Like here's where we are. Here's what I care about. It's a little bit why I've got emails from people where each member of the couple has taken that assessment, and then they sit down and talk about it. And like, oh, I didn't know that, or what's happening there. So I think it highlights communication as being significant. There's another piece too, which is part of what makes this so hard, is we have to look around the corner. Like how, like not only is one member of the couple changing, but both are. And so what things you might have agreed on in the past may be different now. There's one member of our course who she's like, wow, this has been much more effective than marriage counseling, because it got some of the issues out for her to then to share with her partner. So I think the key point you highlight, Ken, is that's a reality. And part of what I'm trying to help emphasize for people is it's a reality with a cost, because if it leads to being stuck in place and you're in the wrong place, it really has a real cost. And sometimes that cost is not fairly burdened, because you might have one person that really does want to stay in that place, another that doesn't. And so in that sense, it's an unfair outcome. But I think there's ways, by digging in a bit further, following a process, being open about it, that real progress can be made.
So
Before
Ryan,
you do that, just, sorry, Martha. We got my favorite question of the day, which will take one word to answer, which is, will the recording of the session be available to our spouses who disagree with us? The answer to that is yes.
So Ryan, at the beginning of the book, you do a really good job of sort of talking about the many influences on healthy longevity, and you talk, and then you sort of fit the importance of place in there. Can you talk a bit more about the whole equation? You know, the other components that are important when thinking about healthy longevity, and then how does place fit into that?
Yeah, this is a really important question. And to some degree, this dialogue is a good example. It's so easy to get caught up in important details. But Martha, what you're describing, it really is the structure that all this stuff fits under. And this, for me, was the aha as I was considering writing the book and then writing it, which is, we don't pay nearly enough attention to the importance of place. And Ken and I talked about this separately. For those who haven't, the season 3 of Century Lives focuses on place, and it's outstanding. It really is, in so many different ways. And it talks about, from these different angles, why that's so significant. And to play off of that, because this is a bit what the podcast gets into, is place is the foundation for healthy longevity. That's my thesis for you. And it does it directly and indirectly. It does it directly because you need to live somewhere. You have physical needs. You have emotional and psychological needs and desires. And your place, that sense of home, plays into that. But even more than that, where you live helps define your purpose. It helps, in a very critical way, define your social circles. Mm-hmm. It helps influence how physically active you are. It has a great impact on your financial well-being. So it has this direct but very meaningful indirect impact on your life. You know, research I've seen, for example, with purpose, you know, your sense of purpose and having something that's bigger than yourself that you can point to on a daily basis, that's the highest correlation to happiness. Mm-hmm. You know, you see all the overwhelming information about loneliness and social disconnection, and the Meta survey that talks about how being regularly lonely is more harmful to your health than having 15 cigarettes a day. Like, it's healthier to be obese than it is to be lonely. Again, if you're in a place where you know your neighbors, you know, it's easier if you're in a place where you just walk outside and you feel like you have a sense of belonging. So this is the headline. The headline is, if you care about living not just a long life, so it's not just lifespan, but an equally long health span, an equally long wealth span, start with place, like both literally and figuratively, and don't start thinking about it when you're 80. You know, it's like the work that has been done in Harvard with their longitudinal study of more than 80 years. Like, it was the relationships people had when they were 60 that really defined the state of their relationships when they were older. These are things that are so significant. That's why I wrote the book for second half of life, but had more and more people come up to me afterwards, and people that have taken the assessment that in their 40s, 30s, 20s, because the principles behind this are true, really, regardless of what age you are.
So Ryan, it's interesting talking about the podcast of the Century Lives. And Kate has put a link to it if people want to follow up. It was interesting to me to discover some places that had that sense of place, places that didn't sort of fit sort of in the obvious map of places you should retire in. So places like Co-op City in the Bronx, that had really affordable, solid living housing that allowed people, community built up because people stayed there, had an incredible effect on healthy longevity. So it was a really interesting lesson for me. So I'm actually curious, are there places that you've come across that you don't end up on the list of, you know, most don't end up on sort of the USA Today's list of 10 best places to retire that people should think about?
You give me so much material to get excited about, Ken. On this list of places, I haven't done this, but there will be a future blog beating up these best places list, because in large part, this is clickbait. Oh, what did I click? And different ads. What we're really solving for is what's the best place for me and perhaps a loved one at this stage in life, for which, like, I get the wind at my back and I can really be engaged in that place. And it doesn't mean there aren't places that have lower cost of living and different, those things matter, but it has to be customized to you. Those lists are not customized to you. So when I think about places, Ken, I think that I think there's probably a number of towns in the Midwest that get overlooked, where there's a sense of friendliness, where there's affordability, where people do look to get out and know their neighbor a bit more. Yeah, maybe the weather's not perfect. I think you've got some, I've actually never been there, but I suspect places like Ann Arbor might be interesting because you got like a college town, you've got a bit of the Midwest kind of friendly feel to it. The affordability, probably there are other places a little less expensive, I'm sure, but nonetheless, there's things there. So I think there is an argument for college towns because you get the intergenerational piece to it. I would look at it's was the subject of at least a term in one of your podcasts that you just mentioned, sort of Century City, but is the NORC, the natural occurring retirement community. Where are there places where it's not advertised as a retirement community, but happens to have a nucleus, maybe not exclusively, but a nucleus of people that are, similar to you in some respects. You can make friends, that you have a sense of community in your building, but ideally you're also, walkable to other things. You can't find those easily. That's the challenge today. Few places have signs in neon that are flashing NORC, NORC, NORC. So it happens a bit more word of mouth. Washington, D.C. has actually quite a number of them. But nonetheless, so I think there is a process, which is a little bit what I do with the workshop and the course, which is what are those preferences and constraints? And then are you really open to living anywhere? Or is it more, hey, I'm someone that my home is Minneapolis, but where is the best place for me in Minneapolis, for example? And that's where you start to be thinking more openly. There actually is quite a number of opportunities, options between a single family home and senior living, for example. But you have to know what questions to ask and be creative about how to find those.
Martha, do you want to do one last question?
I think just the last question we got in the chat, it's interesting that access to medical care does not seem to be a priority here.
So
that's
it
a good
is.
question. Yes.
Yeah, it's a good question. We haven't talked about it. Good point. But it is. What I would say is that I've seen it come up in two different contexts. At least I've seen one which, hey, my specialty physicians are important to me. How can I make sure that that level of care I can still get if I were to move somewhere else? And there's another piece which is related to the provision of services, of health services. And it's important that in where you are, you get some temperature as to what the level of quality is of those things. And I would also say for those that are looking at senior living, don't just assume because they have that, they're good at it or it's high quality. I know a number of people that have been disappointed. Well, if they had that service, it just turned out it wasn't very good. I have a chapter in the book that talks specifically about how our healthcare system is changing. And this is relevant for people because more and more you're seeing healthcare come to you. You not necessarily have to go to it. And I expect those trends to accelerate. So what that means is on the margin, you might be in a better situation where you feel good about the physical elements of your home. Don't feel like you have to run to a health facility just yet. As I think it'll be more things will be coming to you as the net is how I see it.
All right, Ryan, thank you for a great conversation. I want to thank everyone for. Yeah, I want to thank everyone who posted in the chat. We only got to a small fraction of. We'd have to be here for another 5 hours to get to all of them. People can find out more about Ryan and his work. We've posted some of his links. Kate's done that, but his website is here.life. And don't forget to register for our next book club event on September 6th with Dan Buettner on his new book, Blue Zones, Secrets for Living Longer. I believe it's actually going to have a piece on Singapore. And October 4th with Marina Hertz on her book, The Lonely Century. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Martha. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Ryan. It was great.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
See you.